All right, so let's continue talking about biomes. What we were talking about in the last lecture, again, was what makes a biome a biome. It's the non-living conditions, the abiotic, the solar exposure, the wind patterns, the landforms, all those things combine to produce an average temperature and rainfall amount that a given region of the Earth receives. That establishes your producer base. The producer base then determines everything above it. So producers are the critical piece of this. They grow in certain areas on Earth because of the amount of rain and the amount of temperature that they receive, as well as hours of sunlight. So that's why in the last lecture we were talking about concerns of these averages changing. So biomes have taken millions of years to establish. And as we change things, the biomes adjust and they go into this transition and they start changing themselves. The concern we're seeing right now is, as these things change, how will humans deal with these changes? So as a grassland receives less rainfall, it changes and it shifts and starts to become more desert-like. Well, you consider most of our grasslands are now cornfields or bean fields. As those corn and bean fields receive less and less moisture every year because of this change in the average rainfall and temperature, what's going to happen to our crops? So those are the concerns we have when we're looking at how climate change is impacting biomes on Earth. Okay, so we're going to take a look at this big map and look at the general pattern of biome distribution. Now, we're not covering all these biomes. You look at other maps and there's more biomes, there's less biomes. These are some of the main big picture biomes that are recognized by most ecologists. And what we're going to do is just focus on some of the main ones, kind of highlight some of the features of them. We're going to start up here at the northernmost biome, the tundra. We're going to talk about taiga. We'll talk about temperate deciduous, because this is technically an Illinois biome. We're also going to talk about the temperate grasslands, or you can call these prairies. This is also an Illinois biome. We'll talk about the tropical rainforest, and we'll talk about some shrubland or chaparral, and then we'll talk about deserts, and we'll also get into savannas. We're not going to get too picky about mountain zones, polar ice, some of those others. Do keep in mind, though, they are recognized biomes. We're just, unfortunately limited with the amount of time we have to cover all these things. All right, so again, key things I want you to remember. When we're looking at a biome, we want to understand the climate of the biome. That climate is determined by the abiotic features, temperature, rain, sunlight. That's what makes a producer grow. So the abiotic features determine your producer base. The producer base equals your consumers. All right, so that's the goal when we're looking at biomes. So to start with, let's look at energy. Remember in the previous lectures we talked about energy, and we talked about food chains and trophic pyramids, and we drew that out, and then we went to this, and then we went to this, and we talked about energy flows from one level of the food pyramid to the next, and so on. Trophic levels, etc. So this map here gives us kind of a neat visual to see how much energy is in a given biome. We can measure this. We can actually go out and do the math and calculate and say, here's the amount of energy in a given biome. So this map is presenting it as grams of energy per square meter over the course of an entire year. Okay, that's what grams meters square per year means. So you look at the colors. Dark green is a lot of energy here. Tropical rainforests, equatorial regions have that type of productivity, which means their producer base is going to be massive. There's a lot of energy there. And that means you can stack up lots and lots and lots of levels above it. So your pyramid goes way up here when you have this big of a base. Versus, we look at the other one, like the polar caps. Or even, let's just go with the tundra. Right there. Those are regions up here. Not much energy there in the tundra. So that means their producer base is really small, which means their pyramid is going to be much smaller, not nearly as many trophic levels. All right, so those are the things we want to look at when we're talking about biomes. Here's another way to look at it. Some of the key biomes we want to discuss are measured and highlighted here. So there's our tropical rainforests. Here is Illinois, temperate deciduous forest. We have roughly 1,550 grams of energy per square meter in a given year. Prairie, native prairie, 750. Our bean fields, 610. Taiga, tundra. Okay, so desert, notice we see this decline in energy as we go from rainforest down to the desert biome. Aquatic ecosystems, we will talk about those. Coral reefs, by far the most productive. Swamps, wetlands, marshes, a lot of productivity. Estuaries, lots of productivity. Go out into the open ocean, though, and there's hardly any energy out there. Open oceans are considered deserts because there's almost no energy in the open ocean. You have little tiny microscopic algae, but that's it. That's why if you go into the middle of the open ocean, you don't find much out there. There's not a lot living out there. The majority of life in the ocean is close to the shores. Continental shelf, shorelines, estuaries, coral reefs, etc. All right, so we're going to explore this as we go through the various biomes. So, all right, to start out with, let's start up north in the tundra. So the tundra region of the world. And this is not just the United States. This is Europe, Asia, Greenland, Iceland, Alaska, etc. In general, the tundra is cold and dark most of the year. A big key feature of the tundra is this thing called permafrost. Okay, this is frozen ground. It freezes when it gets cold and dark, and it turns into a solid, frozen, big giant popsicle. The tundra then has a very short growing season. And when it grows, that growing season, the permafrost starts to melt and starts to thaw out just a little bit, just at the surface. If you dig down a foot, you're into frozen ground. But the 6, 8, maybe 10 inches at the top of the permafrost, the top layer of the ground, what you'd be walking on, is thawing out, and it's going to start to get squishy and wet and just a big mess. That's perfect for certain species. But because then it freezes up pretty quickly, most species that inhabit the tundra are migratory. They don't stay around because that growing season is only a couple months, and then it gets cold and dark and frozen. You got to head south. You got to get out of there. So during the growing season, though, the tundra is this explosion of diversity. All of this plant life just explodes and flowers and reproduces and provides a lot of food, a lot of insects because of the pools of water collecting on the tundra. So lots and lots of life there. Most of our geese and ducks will have babies up in the tundra because there's so much food available during the growing season. So they time their migration to land in the tundra just as the growing season is starting. They mate, they give birth, and then as the growing season ends, all those little babies are big enough, they start migrating south. Our big herbivores like caribou, they're up there feeding during that growing season. But again, cold and dark, when that time of the year approaches, most things, let's start heading south. Let's start moving south into a different biome. The plant life of the tundra tends to be short and low lying. You don't have big giant trees in the tundra. They can't grow in frozen ground. They can't get the roots down into the frozen ground. So most things are just shallow rooted surface plants, but it works. And it creates a unique biome with a lot of interesting species. Some of them you're not going to find all in a lot of other parts of the planet. So we don't want to destroy the tundra, even though we may look at it and think it doesn't have much value. It is an important biome that we want to keep an eye on and make sure is managed correctly. But let's follow those caribou. Or better yet, let's follow the geese. Let's move south. South, we're going to start to move into what we call the taiga. Now, the taiga is also known as pine forests, or the other term you may see is a boreal forest. This has a longer growing season, so an extended growing season compared to the tundra. So with a longer growing season, your producer base is bigger, which allows more food. And now you can have larger herbivores. And with larger herbivores, this is going to attract carnivores and a bigger diversity of life. They do still have a winter. Winter hits, species often migrate. Migrate. They're going to migrate during the winter. They're going to get out of the taiga. It's cold. There's not as much food available. A lot of species migrate during that winter, and they move south. So those geese came from the tundra. They made it to the taiga. They spent some time in the taiga, feeding, fueling up. And then they said, okay, let's move further south. Let's make our way down into these biomes. Now, geese will follow what we call different flyways. Some of them are coastal, others go through the center of the states, the U.S., but what they tend to do is follow the water. They follow river systems. All right, so taiga, some really cool animals and plants in the taiga, pine forests. This is where our Christmas trees come from naturally. They are native to the taiga. Christmas trees growing in Illinois are invasive. They were brought here intentionally and planted, but they are not a native species to our forests. They're native to Canada and Michigan and Wisconsin and those parts of the U.S. that have the taiga biome. Again, they can survive in Illinois, but this is not their natural biome. So when you go up to Wisconsin, pine trees are everywhere. It's hard to find an oak tree or a maple or other trees that we're used to from central Illinois because that's not the biome for those trees. So the biome for oak trees and hickories and maples is what we call the temperate deciduous forest. Now the key things here, in temperate deciduous forests, we have 4 distinct seasons. Because we have these distinct seasons, our producer base can get bigger. It expands, it's larger. You only have to worry about cold for 2 months, maybe 3 months in the temperate deciduous forest. And most species here, instead of migrating when it gets cold, they'll hibernate instead. So during the winter, why move? You only have to burrow up and go into hibernation for 2 or 3 months. It's going to be a lot less stressful than trying to relocate to a new biome. So we have a lot of diversity in the temperate deciduous forest, but the key is distinct seasons. Spring, summer, fall, winter, back to spring, summer, fall, winter. So all the plants and animals in our biome are adapted to that. We have a lot of producers. We have a big producer base compared to taiga and tundra. We have lots of carnivores. We have lots of herbivores and all sorts of different diversity in the temperate deciduous forest because we have a different climate than what we see in the tundra and the taiga. So we'll keep looking at other biomes as we move into our next lecture.